I think it's about time I get back to growing my new Space Marine army. A few episodes ago, I dove headfirst into the army with customizing a box of intercessors, but they're starting to look a little bit lonely on the shelf. Looks like they're in need of a little leadership. What's up folks, and welcome back to Plaid Hobbies. Last episode, we tackled the entire starter box for the Emperor's Children, painting up about 33 models. So I think I owe myself a little bit of a break today. So this time we're just going to be painting up one model. Now this model is a character unit, so we're going to be giving him a little extra love compared to our rank and file units. I'm really glad I started this army with a box of infantry and not a character unit. It really gave me a chance to experiment a bit and get a feel for what works and what doesn't work. So now that I have a bit more understanding of my scheme, let's apply that to a Space Marine captain to lead these fellas. To do this, I'm going to be kitbashing this horse Heresy Praetor I bought a few years back. I actually got him for a pretty decent price since the box was pretty heavily damaged. Much like with the intercessors, I'm going to be using a mix of 3D printed bits and other materials to spruce up this guy. I got out my usual tools and I ripped up the instructions because this guy's going to be a pretty simple build. Who needs instructions anyways, right? Apparently me, because I was immediately confused by some of the part placements. After repairing the book, I got to cleaning the parts. Just the usual nub removal and mold line cleaning. The mold lines on this guy weren't too bad thankfully, so it didn't take too long. Once he was all cleaned up, I started thinking of a game plan on how I'm going to personalize this guy. I grabbed a 3D printed beaky helmet that I knew would fit this guy perfectly, and I temporarily held it in place with some blue tack. This helmet was 3D printed from Red Warden Games. They make some great grimdark bits, so feel free to check them out if you want to. The links for their store are in the description. Next thing I wanted to change was the arm placement. The official pose is fine, but I think it was a little bit stiff. I want to have it pointing off to the side, almost like he's ready in a battle stance. This arm is slightly monopose, so I'll have to do a bit of surgery to get it to look right. The first thing I did was clip off the cable that connects to his back, as well as the guiding group that helps lock it in place on his body. Removing these should give me a much better range of motion. Because there isn't a solid surface to glue the arm onto now, I need to pin it. I grabbed a piece of paperclip and cut off a piece longer than I needed. I poked a guiding hole with my hobby blade and then started drilling it out with a pin vise. I did the same thing to the arm and then started dry fitting to see how much paperclip I'll need to trim off. I trimmed off little bits at a time until I got the proper fit I wanted. Then super glued it all in place. The pose for the other arm seemed fine, so I just left it as is. Next up, I started playing dress up. I have a ton of these custom shoulder pads that I 3D printed from Great Tide Studios. I used them a lot in my past Intercessor video and I want to keep using them again for the rest of the army. They offer a ton of really cool conversion bits to add some spice to your army, so all the shop links are in the description. I mixed and matched shoulder pads until I found the exact combo that I liked. Once I was satisfied with my choices, I locked them down with some super glue. These custom shoulders really added the bulk I was looking for. Really makes them stand out a lot more among all the infantry. I normally leave capes separate for easier painting, but this fit was kind of awkward on this kit, so I decided to just glue it on. I looked through my resin bits to find a suitable replacement for his power pack ornament. My army's main motif are candles and blue psychic aura, so I wanted something to match that. I think this candelabra from Great Tide Studios would fit perfectly. Since superglue isn't a chemical bond, I decided to pin the resin part to the backpack in addition to gluing it. This should give it a lot more stability. Because I'm using a different head from the base kit, the entire neck area was completely hollow. So to fill this, I used some green stuff. I made multiple small balls of it and started stuffing the holes, supergluing each one on top of each other. I used the sculpting tool to get the exact concave shape that I wanted, then finally used the head to mark a perfect gap for the helmet to sit in. Next up was getting the bases done. I grabbed my bag of bark chips that I took from a dentist office planter and started looking for one that would fit the base. Most of them were a bit too tall, but I found one that was the perfect height. I then grabbed some smaller bark chips to make a tactical rock for him to put his little feeties up on. It needed to be slightly smaller, so I used the hobby saw to split it in half. Next up, I filled a lot of gaps with wood glue and sprinkled some mixed grain sand and pebbles onto it. This should give a nice natural transition between the two pieces of bark. For the rest of the gaps, I used some AK Light Earth texture paste. I used this mainly on the exposed parts of the base to add a bit of transition from the cork to the raw plastic. I dry fitted him onto the base and he fits perfectly. I almost forgot I wanted to add some chain to him as well. I cut off a piece and then superglued it hidden underneath his shoulder pad. Then I wrapped it around his back and I reconnected it to the front. I superglued the connection point and locked it all in place. I also wanted to give some texture to his cape. I used some Tamiya putty with a disposable brush and started stippling it randomly just on the lower portions of the cape. Once that was all good and dried, I mounted him to some painting handles and I got ready to prime. Once I got everything fully primed and dried, I started base coating them with the same paints I used last time. I started with a dark brownish red as a warm base coat and then a heavy zenithal of a beige yellow. Both of these will be sprayed mostly from above, leaving some of the black primer visible underneath for some contrast. Once that was good, I base coated the helmet and the accessories with some white. I used more vibrant yellow paints to dry brush all over the model. The base coat was pretty flat and neutral, so I wanted to use this yellow to hit all the highest points of the model and bring back some of that vibrancy. Doing this first before painting any of the other parts of the model is essential. since you don't have to worry about accidentally getting yellow paint on any parts of the model that you don't want it. And just for a bit more punch, I grabbed a really bright yellow and a small dry brush and only hit the highest points of the model just to give it a bit more extra vibrancy. Before I move on to painting any of the other parts of the model, I wanted to get the paint chipping done as well. I ripped up some pieces of kitchen sponge very roughly to get some random textures. For the first step of chipping, I mixed a highlight color with some white and then stippled it semi-heavily. This will replicate the more superficial paint chips. After that, I did the same thing with the dark brown paint, making sure to add chips only on top of where I did the last ones. These will be the heavier, deeper paint chips. Having both of these laid on top of each other will add a lot more artificial depth to the armor. I also made sure to get most of the paint chips around the corners and exposed areas of the armor, since that's where the paint would naturally tend to chip off more. Once I was satisfied with that, I began picking out all the other parts of the armor. The gray is one of the main secondary colors of my army, so I started with that. Any armor trim and solid shoulder piece got a full coat of dark gray. This guy has tons of armor decoration, so it was really fun to paint it all gray. The level of color separation really adds a lot more uniqueness to a model, which again will make him stand out a lot more from the infantry on the tabletop, which to me is kind of what you want with character units. I also painted the power pack a full gray as well. After 2 thin coats of that, I started my highlights. I started with a light gray paint. I used a small controlled dry brush to lightly hit all of the raised parts of the gray, being really careful not to touch any of the yellow. I love dry brushing because you can immediately start to see results and all of your details will start to pop. For my basic infantry, this is where I would have probably left it, but for characters, you gotta go all out. I mixed in some light blue to my gray to add a bit of coldness to the color, and I started highlighting it with a fine paintbrush. I made sure only to hit the tops of the details as the light source was coming from directly above. As a digital artist, I've never really been interested in doing smooth paint blends. I prefer personally the more blotchy and impressionist style of layering colors on top of each other, and it kind of gives the impression of depth and highlights. I really like the texture it gives. Personally, I don't really enjoy doing edge highlights on any of my models. I much prefer a more painterly approach to stacking colors roughly. I personally like this style more, and it allows me to have a lot more freedom with how I paint. Once that layer was done, I grabbed another lighter gray and started painting in more highlights. For this stage, I made sure to stick these highlights only within the last layer of the highlights. This helps build the illusion that it's getting brighter as it gets closer to the source light. And finally, one very controlled highlight pass with just pure white, just to add that slight bit of reflectiveness to the tops of the surface. This was my first time really going all out on non-metallic metal, and man, it was a blast. I really want to try doing this again for more models. The pop it added to this paint job was awesome, and I'd love to try to replicate it again. Next up, I wanted to start tackling all the decorations and soft materials on the model. First was the little scroll he has on his shoulders and his tabard. I started out with a darker beige paint as a base coat. Once that was dry, I used a slightly lighter beige tone and started picking out the highest areas. Instead of doing this with smooth passes of paint, I filled in those areas with cross-hatching. This meant doing tons of little thin lines to fill out the area, leaving a slight gap between all of the lines. This will help give the illusion of texture. We'll see this more in the details later on the cape. I kept adding highlights until I got them to a nice parchment color. I moved on to the tabard, and with the same colors I based and highlighted it. This time making the strokes a lot more noticeable. This is meant to be woven cloth, so I really want to be able to see that texture in it, as opposed to the scroll on the shoulder, which is just plain paper. Again, lots and lots of lines rather than clean paint strokes. If you want to add an easy texture to your models, this is a great way to do it. It's a bit time consuming, but what part of miniature painting isn't? Once I was satisfied with that, I broke out the dark red paint and began basing all of the red on the model with it. This meant the tabard trim, the cape, and a few pieces of the armor. In my excitement to having to paint 2 hours worth of texture, I dropped the model and broke off the power pack ornament. So I just took this opportunity to keep painting without risking breaking it off again. I'll just glue it back on later. This might be a new record for me breaking a model before it even touches the tabletop. I grabbed the largest brush I could and began base coating the cape. Normally I would mask and do all the base coats and highlights with an airbrush for a smoother, faster highlight, but I kinda wanted to practice my brush skills with this model, especially since it's a character. I try to save a lot of my speedrunning tricks for more units like infantry. Characters deserve all the love and attention. Besides, you know, these guys sometimes cost as much as a unit of 10 models, so you gotta get every penny's worth. Now that the base coats were done, I superglued the broken part back in place. In theory, I should have pinned it for extra security, but I'm a lazy hobbyist, so I'll leave it until it inevitably breaks again. But if this happens to you, definitely pin it. Do as I say, not as I do. While I waited for the cape to dry, I wanted to give the helmet a bit more love. I used some watered down skeleton horde contrast paint on the helmet to give it a bit more of a bone color. This will also cover the wash and shading portion of the process as well. To bring back some of the brightness, I dry brushed a lighter bony white all over the helmet. Now for the final highlights, I mixed a bit of white into my last paint to use to brighten it up a bit, and did some light strokes of paint with a fine tip brush on just the highest points of the helmet. Now for the other colors. This guy's a captain, so he needs to look the part with all the fancy colors and whatnot. I started painting a dark gray trim on the helmet feathers, highlighting it up to a light gray using a bit of water to feather out the transition. I cannot recommend this Vallejo detail brush enough for this. Having a really fine point brush is like a game changer, especially for any tiny details like this. Once the trim was done, I used the same dark red from the cape to paint in some of the feathers. I watered it down a bit too much by mistake, so I did a few coats of this until it was solid. While that dried, I went in and picked out all the eye lenses with a black paint. I let that sit for a bit and then went back to the rest of the miniature. Now that the super glue was all dried, I painted the rest of the candelabra the exact same way I painted the rest of the gray on the model. All the red base coats on the helmet and capes are dry now, so I started tackling them all at the same time. I grabbed a brighter red, and then picked out the highlights on the helmet feathers, the tabard, elbow armor, and finally, the cape. I put the most attention on the cape since that's where we'll need to put the most detail. Much like before, I picked out all the curved parts that stick out with my highlight colors, starting from the top down, only doing lots and lots of thin strokes of paint. It may not look like much now, but the more you layer it up and the more brighter colors you add, you really start to see the texture stand out more. Definitely a trust the process kind of deal. Next up was an even brighter red. This time I made sure to cover even less surface area than the first coat. That slight layered up effect will add a lot of dimension to the paint job. Again, lots of downward strokes. For my final highlight, I added a bit of white into my last paint. Red's a weird color because if you add white to it, it'll become pink, which is a bit too harsh of a highlight sometimes. In some cases it'll work fine, but here I really wanted to stick with that royal red look. So one way to tone back the pink is to use a watered down red contrast paint and go over top of it. This will help make it appear a bit more red than pink, but it'll also help tie in all the layers together as well. I think we're getting really close to getting this guy looking like my intercessors. Just a couple things left to do though. I gotta paint the little red scar marks on their eyes as well. I think this will be a staple across my entire army. I still had to paint the Wargear, so to do that, I grabbed some lead belcher as my base coat and painted the gun and tubes that connected to it. To wash and weather it, I added a coat of rattling grime contrast paint over the whole thing. I decided to pick out all the decorations on the armor with gold. I did the same trick I used in my Emperor's Children video, where my 2 coats of gold consisted of a regular gold base coat and then a more rich gold speed paint over top. The speed paint acts as a second coat and a wash, getting 2 steps done at the same time. And then I also picked out the handles on his sword with the same red paint as the cape. His scroll's looking a little bit empty, so I used my finest paintbrush and a dark gray paint to lightly add some squiggly lines that at a glance will look like text. Although there's one thing missing from it, I think. Perfect. I broke out the lead belcher one last time to paint the guard on the sword with, as well as for some rough highlights on the gun. One of the last details I needed to do was to paint the skull on the candelabra. I started with a chocolate brown base coat and I worked my way up from beiges to light tans to get the skull color looking perfect. I didn't paint any of the areas that I wanted to glow on yet. I don't want these to get dulled down by the next step, so the sword and armor glow will be the final step on this guy. After varnishing him to protect him from the paint layers, just like the Intercessor squad, I airbrushed some track wash all over him. This will tint the armor a much darker brown color. Again, this looks scary since I'm basically covering up all the work that we just did, but trust the process. Also, I can't stress this enough, if you're airbrushing enamels, please wear a mask. Make sure you're doing this in good ventilation. Nurgle's rot may be fictional, but destroying your lungs definitely isn't. Once he was thoroughly covered, I went straight to the next step. I used some white spirits and a Q-tip to remove most of the enamel wash that we just sprayed on, making sure to add a lot of focus to the highlighted areas. Enamel washes are my favorite, especially if you like the more grim, dark, grimy style. It covers a lot of steps in one. It adds some shadows, it washes your model, tints the color to make it darker, and adds a nice weathered tone to everything. If you're gonna do this, just make sure you do the removal process right after spraying the enamels on. I find that if you wait a few days until the enamel sets more, it's a lot harder to remove. Now that I removed what I could, he's looking thoroughly grimed up. Since enamels take a few days to dry, I figured I'd knock out the base while I wait. I pretty much did the same process as last time. I used a light gray Tamiya paint, which for the life of me, I could not open. I tried tools, and I even tried a heat gun, which finally got the lid to bulge. And this is why I prefer dropper bottles. After washing up, I put the paint to my airbrush and gave it a nice coat from the top down. I let some of the black primer from underneath show through, acting like a shadow. Once that dried, I dry brushed a light gray mixed with some white, hitting all the rocks in the texture. I then grabbed some snow texture paste and put it sporadically on the base, constantly checking to make sure I leave areas blank where the model's gonna stand. Finally, a few grass tufts and the base was done. Now the part that always strikes fear into my heart. Object source lighting. I need to redeem myself from the first video. I got so carried away and heavy-handed with how I applied the glow effect that I completely washed out some of the colors I did on the rest of the models. With this guy, I'm going to try to keep it as controlled and precise as I can. I first started painting some lightning strikes on the sword with a titanium white paint, starting from the base of the sword moving to the tip. To smooth them out a bit, I airbrushed some white ink very lightly around them. I also did a heavy airbrush of the same white at the base of the blade since that's where the source of the glow would be and it would naturally be the brightest spot. After that, I airbrushed the blue ink over top the sword. Despite the inks normally being pretty transparent, it kind of covered up all the lightning strikes that I just did, but you know what, that's okay, I'll get back to those later. I added another puff of white to the base, and then airbrushed a fluorescent paint to smooth out the transition. I finished it off with a darker ink towards the tip of the blade, since that's where it would naturally get the least amount of light. I went back to the same white ink again and airbrushed it all over the parts that would have had a glow. The neck, the flames in the power pack, and the underside of the helmet. This time I made sure to go as light and controlled as possible, trying not to overspray too much. I wanted to tackle the lightning on the sword one more time, so I took out the same brush I did last time and did the same thing. Finally, I put a blue wash over the lightning to blend it all together. For the rest of the glow, I used a blue fluorescent paint all over the white parts. I then went over that with white again, but keeping it more to the center where the base of the light is coming from. Doing this is kind of a balancing act, going back and forth between the source light and the glow color. I did this multiple times back and forth until I got the look I was satisfied with. I added some very light puffs of blue with the airbrush on the legs where the sword glow would naturally be cast onto. I then finished it off with watery paint and a brush. The final step of the glow was to dry brush a dark blue just at the tips farthest away from the source light. Once that was all good and done, I super glued him to his base. There's one last thing I wanted to try as a motif for this army. I think an owl could work as a cool symbol or theme for the army, so I wanted to try something with that. I 3D printed these owl models from Zabavka Workshop. They have tons of really cool basing and thematic diorama bits available for 3D print, so feel free to check them out. Their shop link is also in the description. I don't want to spend too long painting this guy up, so I started with some contrast paint snakebite leather. This already covers my base coat and my wash. I then worked my way up from multiple beige paints all the way up to white. I did this all with a dry brush. I glued him to the model and started picking out some of the highlights with a brush. I think a white snow camouflaged owl would fit really well as a motif for this army, especially considering the snowy bases. In my manhandling, I managed to break him off by accident, so I super glued him back this time with 3 points of connection to the model. This should help it be a little stronger. I did some quick object source lighting with some watery ink and called it finished. And with that, I painted all the bases brown, and my first character for my Space Marine army is complete. This guy was an absolute blast to work on from start to finish. I feel like I learned a ton not only in the painting department, but even just about my army. I thought of so many new ways of doing things as well as the possible owl motif. I still have a few more 3D printed owls, so I'll save those for some future builds. My goal with these Marines is to get them to the first 1,000 points all on camera. I have a list already made, which means the models are all sitting next to me ready to be built. The next model is going to be a really fun one, so stay tuned for that. Genuinely, this might be my favorite miniature I've ever painted. It's one of those rare projects where you physically feel like you've leveled up your skills after finishing it. On top of that, I feel like I really redeemed myself with the glow effects on this guy as well. The intercessors I went a bit too overboard to the point where you can't really tell what the base coat is at some parts. With this guy though, I think I managed to confine the glow to exactly where I needed it to be. I think the tons of layers of inks and white really helped sell the look a lot better too. Seeing him standing next to his battle brothers is super satisfying. He looks like he fits right in. I still gotta think of a name for these guys and some proper lore though. I'd also love to do some custom named characters at some point in the future as well. I think once I get to my first 1,000 points of Space Marines, that should give me plenty of time to get some ideas cooking. Also, the next Space Marine themed video is about halfway filmed, so expect that guy within the coming month. I want to try working on some smaller, lighter content that I can make between larger build projects like this, just to keep uploads more consistent. So if you guys have any ideas for things you want to see like that, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm super excited to keep these guys going, as well as getting through my backlog of unpainted stuff from my other armies. My main army is Death Guard, so there's still a ton of stuff in that army that I want to get painted, so I'd love to do it on video at some point as well. And with that, this has been Plaid Hobbies. Thank you for watching, have a great night, and I'll see you all in the next episode.
And now, folks, we thank you for joining us tonight. We hope this evening was filled with love and entertainment, and that you happily sleep through the night and join us again tomorrow. Good night, and sleep well.